The morning sun cast long shadows across the outdoor shooting range as Sarah Chen adjusted her safety glasses and loaded another magazine into her pistol. The familiar weight of the weapon in her hands brought a sense of calm that had become increasingly rare in her life. At 28, she had been coming to this range every Tuesday and Thursday for the past 6 months, ever since the divorce papers were finalized, and she realized she needed something to help her rebuild her confidence. The range was mostly empty at this early hour, which Sarah preferred. She could focus on her breathing, her stance, and the satisfying precision of each shot without feeling self-conscious about her still developing skills. Her instructor, Marcus, had told her she was a natural, but Sarah knew she still had a long way to go before she would feel truly comfortable with firearms. She had grown up in a household where guns were viewed with suspicion and fear. Her parents, both college professors, believed that violence was never the answer and that guns only brought trouble. But, after her ex-husband's increasingly erratic behavior during their separation, including several incidents where he had shown up at her apartment unannounced and refused to leave, Sarah had decided she needed to take responsibility for her own safety. The first few weeks at the range had been terrifying. Her hands would shake so badly she could barely hold the weapon steady, and the sound of gunfire from other shooters made her jump every time. But Marcus had been patient with her, teaching her proper grip, stance, and breathing techniques. Slowly, she had begun to develop muscle memory and confidence. Today felt different, though. As Sarah fired her first round of shots at the paper target 25 yards away, she noticed her grouping was tighter than usual. Her breathing was steady, her grip firm but not tense, and she was finding that sweet spot between focus and relaxation that Marcus had told her about. She was in the middle of reloading when she heard footsteps behind her. The range officer, Jim, was approaching with a man she had never seen before. The stranger was tall and lean, with short dark hair and intense green eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He moved with a fluid grace that suggested both confidence and careful control. "Sarah, I'd like you to meet Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison," Jim said. "He's going to be using the range for some training exercises, and I thought you two might benefit from working together." Sarah felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. She was just a beginner, and this man was clearly a professional. The way he carried himself, the way his eyes automatically scanned the range for safety violations, the casual way he nodded at her while maintaining perfect awareness of his surroundings, everything about him screamed military training. "Please, just Jake," the man said, extending his hand. His grip was firm but brief, and Sarah noticed calluses on his fingers that spoke of years of weapons handling. "Jim tells me you've been making great progress here." Sarah managed a nervous laugh. "I'm still pretty new to all this. I'm sure you won't want to be slowed down by a beginner." Jake's expression softened slightly, and Sarah caught a glimpse of something that looked like understanding in his eyes. "Everyone starts somewhere. Mind if I watch your next round? Sometimes a fresh perspective can be helpful." Sarah felt her nervousness increase exponentially. Having this clearly experienced shooter watch her felt like being asked to perform surgery while a renowned doctor looked over her shoulder. But something in Jake's manner suggested this wasn't about judgment or criticism. She took her position, checked her stance, and raised her weapon. Her hands were steadier than she expected, and she managed to fire a respectable grouping into the center mass of her target. When she lowered the pistol and engaged the safety, she turned to see Jake nodding approvingly. "Good fundamentals," he said simply. "Your breathing is controlled, and you're not jerking the trigger." "How long have you been shooting?" "About 6 months, Sarah admitted. "I never thought I'd be the type of person who would own a gun, but circumstances change, I guess." Jake's expression grew more serious. "Mind if I ask what changed?" Sarah hesitated. She had never talked about her personal situation with anyone at the range except Marcus, and even then, she had kept the details vague. But something about Jake's direct question and genuine interest made her feel like she could trust him with at least part of the truth. "My ex-husband," she said finally. "The divorce got complicated, and he started showing up places he shouldn't. My lawyer suggested I might want to consider some form of personal protection." Jake nodded without judgment. Sarah was grateful he didn't offer empty reassurances or ask probing questions about details she wasn't ready to share. "Have you done any tactical training?" he asked instead. "Range shooting is great for building fundamentals, but real-world situations require different skills." Sarah shook her head. "I'm still working on hitting the target consistently. I figured tactical stuff was way beyond my level." Actually, this might be the perfect time to introduce some basic concepts, Jake said. Would you be interested in learning a few things that could make a real difference if you ever need to use these skills outside of a controlled environment like this? Sarah felt a mix of excitement and terror at the suggestion. Part of her was thrilled at the opportunity to learn from someone who clearly had extensive experience. Another part of her was intimidated by the idea of moving beyond the safety and predictability of target shooting. I don't want to take up your training time, she said. Jake smiled for the first time since she had met him, and the expression transformed his entire face. Trust me, teaching someone who's genuinely interested in learning is never a waste of time. Besides, I've got all day, and it's been a while since I've had a chance to work on instruction techniques. Before Sarah could overthink it, she found herself nodding. Okay, but you'll have to be patient with me. I'm still figuring out the basics. The fact that you know you're still learning tells me you're already ahead of a lot of people, Jake said. Let's start with something simple. Show me how you would respond if someone approached you from behind while you were shooting. Sarah felt her stomach drop. This was exactly the kind of scenario that had been keeping her awake at night, the reason she had started coming to the range in the first place. The thought of someone approaching her from behind while she was holding a weapon made her realize how little she actually knew about handling firearms in anything other than a controlled, predictable environment. I honestly have no idea, she admitted. I guess I'd turn around? Jake shook his head gently. That's actually one of the most dangerous things you could do. You'd be sweeping everyone on the range with your muzzle, and you'd be putting yourself in a position where you couldn't control both the weapon and the situation. He moved to stand beside her rather than behind her, maintaining a respectful distance while positioning himself where she could see him clearly. The first rule in any situation where you're armed is to maintain control of your weapon. That means never allowing the muzzle to point at anything you're not willing to destroy, even when you're surprised or confused. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the complexity of what she was learning. At the same time, she was grateful to discover these concepts in a safe environment rather than figuring them out during an actual emergency. What should I do instead? She asked. First, keep your weapon pointed downrange. Always. Then, assess the situation before you decide how to respond. Most of the time, someone approaching you at a range is going to be a range officer or another shooter with a legitimate reason for getting your attention. Jake demonstrated the proper way to secure a weapon while maintaining awareness of surroundings. His movements were smooth and automatic, the result of years of training and experience. Sarah tried to copy his technique, feeling clumsy and uncertain in comparison. Don't worry about feeling awkward, Jake said, apparently reading her frustration. This stuff becomes second nature with practice, but everyone feels unnatural when they're learning new motor skills. As the morning progressed, Jake introduced Sarah to concepts she had never considered. He taught her about situational awareness, about the importance of having a plan before she ever touched her weapon, and about the legal and ethical responsibilities that came with carrying a firearm. What impressed Sarah most was Jake's teaching style. He never made her feel stupid for asking questions, and he never assumed she understood concepts that hadn't been explicitly explained. He also seemed to have an intuitive sense of how much information she could absorb at one time, introducing new ideas gradually and allowing her time to practice each skill before moving on to the next. You mentioned earlier that your ex-husband has been showing up places unexpectedly, Jake said during a break in their training. Have you considered getting a restraining order? Sarah felt her shoulders tense. I tried. The judge said there wasn't enough evidence of actual threats. Apparently showing up at someone's workplace and calling them 50 times a day doesn't qualify as harassment unless there are explicit threats of violence. Jake's expression darkened. That's frustrating. What about your local police department? Have they been helpful? Sarah let out a bitter laugh. They told me to call back when something actually happens. One officer suggested I should try to work things out with my ex since we used to be married. That's unacceptable, Jake said flatly. Police officers should never suggest that someone try to work things out with a person who's engaging in stalking behavior. Sarah felt a wave of validation at Jake's response. For months, she had been wondering if she was overreacting, if her fears were justified, if she was being paranoid. Having someone with obvious experience in security and threat assessment confirm that her concerns were legitimate meant more to her than she could express. The thing is, Sarah continued, I keep second-guessing myself. Maybe he's not actually dangerous. Maybe I'm being dramatic. Maybe I should just move to a different city and start over somewhere else. Jake was quiet for a moment, and Sarah worried she had shared too much personal information with someone she had just met. But, when he spoke, his voice was gentle and serious. Sarah, I want you to listen to me carefully. The fact that you're questioning your own judgment is actually a sign that you're dealing with someone who's been systematically undermining your confidence. Healthy people don't show up at their ex-spouse's workplace repeatedly after being asked to stop. They don't call 50 times a day. They don't ignore clear boundaries. Sarah felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She had been feeling crazy for so long that having someone validate her perceptions was almost overwhelming. You don't know him, she said. Maybe he's just having a hard time with the divorce. Maybe if I'm more patient. No, Jake interrupted firmly. His feelings about the divorce are his responsibility to manage, not yours to accommodate. You are not responsible for managing his emotions or helping him accept your decision to end the marriage. The conviction in Jake's voice cut through the fog of doubt that had been clouding Sarah's thinking for months. She realized that somewhere along the way, she had started accepting responsibility for her ex-husband's behavior, as if she could control his actions by being more understanding or more careful about her own responses. I've been trying so hard not to make him angry, she admitted. I thought if I could just handle the situation perfectly, he would eventually accept that our marriage is over and move on. Jake shook his head. That's not how this works. You can't manage someone else's behavior by being perfect. All you can do is set clear boundaries and enforce them consistently. Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of tension she hadn't even realized she was carrying. For the first time in months, she felt like she might not be losing her mind. How do you know so much about this stuff? She asked. Jake was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah wondered if she had asked too personal a question. But then he spoke, and his voice carried a weight that suggested personal experience rather than just professional training. I have a sister who went through something similar. I learned a lot about the psychology of stalking and domestic violence during that time. I also learned that women are often their own worst enemies when it comes to trusting their instincts about danger. Sarah nodded, recognizing the truth in his statement. She had always been someone who tried to see the best in people, who believed that most problems could be solved through communication and understanding. But she was beginning to realize that not all people operated from the same framework of respect and empathy that she took for granted. The sound of other shooters arriving at the range reminded Sarah that the morning was progressing. She looked at her watch and was surprised to see that she and Jake had been talking for over 2 hours. I should probably let you get back to your own training, she said. Thank you for spending so much time with me. I learned more today than I have in weeks of coming here on my own. Jake seemed to consider something for a moment before speaking. Would you be interested in continuing this conversation sometime? I think there's a lot more you could learn about personal protection that goes beyond just shooting skills. Sarah felt a flutter of nervousness mixed with excitement. Part of her was eager to continue learning from someone with Jake's obvious expertise. Another part of her worried about getting involved with someone new when her life was still so complicated. I don't want to be a project, she said honestly. I'm not looking for someone to rescue me or fix my problems. Jake's response was immediate and reassuring. I'm not offering to rescue you. I'm offering to teach you skills that will help you rescue yourself. There's a big difference. Sarah studied his face, looking for any sign of the patronizing attitude she had encountered from several well-meaning friends and family members who thought they knew what was best for her. Instead, she saw respect and genuine interest in helping her develop her own capabilities. Okay, she said finally. I'd like that. As Jake gathered his equipment and prepared to begin his own training session, Sarah felt a sense of possibility that had been absent from her life for months. She wasn't naive enough to think that learning better shooting techniques would solve all her problems, but she was beginning to believe that she might be capable of taking control of her own safety and security. For the first time since her marriage had ended, Sarah felt like she might be moving towards something positive rather than just running away from something negative. And, while she had no idea where this new path would lead, she was finally ready to find out. 3 weeks later, Sarah found herself at a different kind of training facility. Jake had suggested they meet at a tactical training center that offered civilian courses in personal protection. The building looked nothing like the peaceful outdoor range where they had first met. Instead of open lanes and paper targets, Sarah saw obstacle courses, mock building layouts, and equipment she couldn't even identify. Her palms were sweating as she signed the waiver and listened to the safety briefing. The instructor, a former police officer named David, explained that today's session would focus on decision-making under stress and weapon retention techniques. Sarah wondered if she was in over her head. Jake appeared beside her as David finished his explanation. "Remember what we talked about," he said quietly. "You're not trying to become a Navy SEAL in one afternoon. You're just learning some basic skills that could make a difference in a real situation." Sarah nodded, but her heart was racing. The other participants in the class looked experienced and confident. She was the only woman in the group, and she felt like everyone could tell she was a beginner just by looking at her. "Today we're going to work on what to do if someone tries to take your weapon away from you," David announced. "This is one of the most important skills you can learn, because losing control of your firearm in a confrontational situation can turn a defensive scenario into a deadly one very quickly." Sarah felt her stomach clench. This was exactly the kind of scenario that haunted her nightmares. What if her ex-husband somehow got hold of her gun? What if her attempt to protect herself ended up giving him the means to hurt her even more seriously? "Sarah, would you mind being our demonstration partner?" David asked. Sarah's first instinct was to decline, but she caught Jake's encouraging nod and forced herself to step forward. David handed her a bright orange training pistol and positioned her in the center of the mat. "Now, I'm going to approach you from behind and try to grab your weapon," David explained. "Don't worry about doing anything perfect. We're just going to show everyone what happens when someone isn't prepared for this kind of attack." Sarah barely had time to process his words before she felt hands grabbing at the training gun. Her immediate response was to hold on tighter and try to pull away, but David easily overpowered her and took control of the weapon within seconds. "Perfect example of what not to do," David said, but his tone was encouraging rather than critical. "Sarah, what was your strategy there?" "I guess I was trying not to let go," Sarah admitted, feeling foolish. "Natural instinct," David said. "But probably the worst thing you can do in this situation. If someone is stronger than you and they've managed to get their hands on your weapon, a tug-of-war is a game you're going to lose." Jake raised his hand. "What should she have done instead?" David smiled. "Great question. Sarah, let's try this again, but this time I want you to do something that's going to feel completely wrong. When I grab for your weapon, I want you to actually push it toward me." Sarah stared at him in disbelief. "Push it toward you? That's the opposite of what every instinct is telling me to do." "Exactly. That's why it works. The attacker is expecting you to pull away, so they're bracing for resistance in the wrong direction. When you suddenly push toward them, you can off-balance them and create an opportunity to regain control." They practiced the technique several times, with David explaining each step carefully. Sarah learned to recognize the moment when someone committed to grabbing her weapon, and how to use their own momentum against them. It was counterintuitive and uncomfortable, but she could see how it might work in a real situation. "The key thing to remember," David said, "is that your goal isn't to win a wrestling match. Your goal is to create enough confusion and imbalance that you can either regain control of your weapon or get away from the threat entirely." As the class progressed, Sarah found herself paired with different partners for various exercises. Each person she worked with offered different challenges, different heights, different weights, different approaches to the scenarios they were practicing. Jake was her partner for the final exercise of the day. As they faced each other on the mat, Sarah realized she felt more nervous working with him than she had with any of the strangers in the class. There was something about Jake's obvious competence that made her want to perform well, but also made her more aware of her own limitations. "Remember, this is just practice," Jake said as they took their positions. "I'm going to try to disarm you, but I'm going to telegraph my movements so you can see them coming." Sarah nodded and raised the training pistol to a ready position. She focused on her breathing and tried to remember everything David had taught them. When Jake made his move, she felt herself start to panic and revert to her old instincts, but then she forced herself to push the weapon toward him instead of pulling away. The technique worked perfectly. Jake found himself off balance and unable to complete the disarm, giving Sarah the opportunity to step back and regain a secure grip on her weapon. "Outstanding," Jake said, and Sarah felt a flush of pride at the genuine approval in his voice. "You trusted the technique even when it felt wrong. That takes real courage." Sarah surprised herself by laughing. "I don't feel very courageous." I feel terrified most of the time. Courage isn't the absence of fear, Jake said seriously. It's feeling afraid and doing what you need to do anyway. What you just did, pushing through your natural instincts to follow a technique that might save your life, that's exactly what courage looks like. After the class ended, Sarah and Jake sat in the parking lot talking about what she had learned. Sarah was exhausted but exhilarated. For the first time since her divorce, she felt like she was building genuine skills rather than just hoping her problems would somehow resolve themselves. I have to admit, 3 months ago I never imagined I'd be spending my Saturday afternoon learning how to fight off someone trying to take my gun away, Sarah said. How does it feel? Jake asked. Sarah considered the question seriously. Scary. But also kind of empowering. Like maybe I'm not as helpless as I thought I was. Jake nodded. That's exactly the point. You're not helpless. You never were. You just needed to learn some skills and gain some confidence. As they talked, Sarah became aware that she was starting to think of Jake as more than just an instructor or casual acquaintance. Over the past few weeks, he had been consistently supportive, patient, and encouraging without ever being condescending or pushy. He treated her like an adult who was capable of making her own decisions, which was a refreshing change from the well-meaning friends and family members who seemed to think she needed constant guidance and protection. Can I ask you something personal? Sarah said. Jake nodded. Of course. Why are you doing this? I mean, helping me learn all this stuff. You barely know me, and it's not like I can pay you for professional instruction. Jake was quiet for a moment, and Sarah worried she had overstepped some boundary. But then, he spoke, and his voice was thoughtful rather than defensive. Honestly? At first it was because you reminded me of my sister when she was going through her situation. She had that same combination of intelligence and determination mixed with self-doubt that made you want to help her see her own strength. Sarah felt a little disappointed that his initial motivation had been seeing her as a reminder of someone else, but she appreciated his honesty. But it's not just that anymore, Jake continued. I've enjoyed getting to know you. You ask good questions, you're willing to challenge your own assumptions, and you don't give up when things get difficult. Those are qualities I respect in anyone, regardless of their situation. Sarah felt warmth spread through her chest. It had been a long time since anyone had described her in such positive terms. During the final months of her marriage, she had started to believe that she was difficult, unreasonable, and impossible to please. Her ex-husband had been skilled at making her feel like every problem in their relationship was somehow her fault. Thank you, she said simply. For everything. Not just the training, but for treating me like I'm capable of handling my own problems. You are capable, Jake said firmly. You've been handling your problems. You recognized that you needed better skills for protecting yourself, and you took action to develop those skills. You identified a situation that wasn't working for you, and you made the difficult decision to change it. That's not the behavior of someone who can't handle her own problems. As Sarah drove home that afternoon, she thought about how much her life had changed in just a few months. She was becoming proficient with firearms, learning tactical skills she had never imagined needing, and developing a friendship with someone who challenged her to see herself more clearly. But, even more importantly, she was beginning to trust her own judgment again. For too long, she had been second-guessing every decision, wondering if her perceptions were accurate, questioning whether her feelings were valid. Now she was starting to believe that her instincts had been right all along. Her phone buzzed with a text message as she pulled into her apartment complex. Her heart sank when she saw her ex-husband's name on the screen. Despite changing her number twice, he somehow kept finding ways to contact her. I saw your car at that gun place today, the message read. You know guns are dangerous, Sarah. You're going to hurt yourself or someone else. We need to talk about this. Sarah felt her hands start to shake as she read the message. Richard had been following her. He knew where she was spending her time and what she was doing. The idea that he had been watching her without her knowledge made her feel sick and vulnerable. Her first impulse was to call him and try to explain herself, to reassure him that she wasn't planning to hurt anyone, to somehow convince him to leave her alone. But then, she remembered what Jake had said about not taking responsibility for managing other people's emotions. Instead, she screenshot the message and forwarded it to her lawyer. Then, she blocked Richard's latest phone number and made a mental note to be more aware of her surroundings when she was coming and going from places. The fact that Richard was escalating his surveillance was frightening, but it also confirmed that her decision to learn self-defense skills had been the right one. She was dealing with someone who didn't respect boundaries and who felt entitled to monitor her activities even after their marriage had ended. That evening, Sarah found herself thinking about the training exercise where she had successfully defended against Jake's disarm attempt. The memory of that moment, the split second when she had trusted her training instead of her fear and it had worked, gave her a sense of confidence that she desperately needed. She was no longer the same person who had been afraid to handle a firearm 6 months ago. She was learning skills that could save her life, developing judgment she could trust, and building relationships with people who saw her as capable and strong. As she got ready for bed, Sarah realized that for the first time in months, she wasn't afraid of what tomorrow might bring. She was still cautious, still aware that Richard's behavior was unpredictable and potentially dangerous. But she no longer felt helpless in the face of that danger. She had spent too many nights lying awake wondering what she would do if Richard showed up at her door uninvited. Now she had a plan, training, and, most importantly, confidence in her ability to protect herself. It wasn't a guarantee that nothing bad would happen, but it was a foundation she could build on. Before she turned off the lights, Sarah sent Jake a text message. "Thank you for today. I learned a lot, and not just about tactics. I'm starting to feel like myself again." His response came back quickly. "You were always yourself. You're just remembering who that person is." Sarah smiled as she read his words. She was remembering who she was, someone who was strong enough to make difficult decisions, smart enough to learn new skills, and brave enough to face her fears head-on. It was a version of herself she had almost forgotten existed, but she was determined never to lose sight of it again. The call came at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. Sarah jolted awake to the sound of her phone buzzing insistently on the nightstand beside her bed. The display showed an unknown number, but something about the timing made her answer despite her better judgment. "Sarah? Thank God you answered." It was Richard's voice, but he sounded different, panicked and slightly slurred. "I need to see you. Right now. It's important." Sarah sat up in bed, instantly alert. "Richard, it's 2 a.m. Whatever this is about can wait until—" "No, it can't wait," he interrupted. "I've been thinking about everything, and I realize I made mistakes. Big mistakes. But I can fix this. We can fix this. I'm outside your building right now." Sarah's blood ran cold. She moved to her bedroom window and carefully peered through the blinds. Sure enough, she could see Richard's car parked across the street under a streetlight. He was sitting in the driver's seat, and she could see the glow of his phone screen illuminating his face. "Richard, you need to leave. Right now. It's inappropriate for you to show up here in the middle of the night, and you're violating the terms of our divorce agreement." "I'm not violating anything," Richard said, his voice taking on the argumentative edge Sarah remembered too well. "I'm parked on a public street. I have every right to be here." Sarah felt her heart rate spike. Technically, he was right. Since she hadn't been able to get a restraining order, there was nothing legally preventing him from sitting in his car on a public street near her apartment building. But the fact that he was using this technicality to continue harassing her made the situation feel even more threatening. "What do you want, Richard?" "I want to talk to you. Face to face. Like adults. I know you're angry with me, and you have every right to be. But I've been going to therapy, Sarah. I'm getting help. I understand now why our marriage fell apart, and I know how to fix it." Sarah closed her eyes and tried to think clearly. Everything about this situation felt dangerous. Richard showing up in the middle of the night, his emotional state, his refusal to respect her boundaries, all of it suggested that his behavior was escalating rather than improving. "Richard, I'm glad you're getting help, but our marriage is over. We're divorced. There's nothing to fix." "Don't say that," Richard's voice cracked. "Please don't say that. I know you still love me. I know you're just scared because I handled things badly before. But I'm different now." Sarah could hear the desperation in his voice, and it frightened her more than anger would have. Desperate people were unpredictable, and unpredictable people were dangerous. "I'm going to hang up now," Sarah said as calmly as she could manage.
I want you to leave, and I don't want you to contact me again.
Sarah, wait, she ended the call and immediately dialed Jake's number. She hadn't wanted to involve him in her personal drama, but something about this situation felt different from Richard's previous attempts to contact her.
More urgent. More unstable. Jake answered on the second ring, sounding alert despite the hour. Sarah? What's wrong?
I'm sorry to call so late, but Richard is outside my building. He called me and said he wanted to talk, and when I looked out the window, he was sitting in his car across the street.
How long has he been there? I don't know.
He just called a few minutes ago, but he could have been sitting out there for hours. There was a brief pause before Jake spoke again.
Are your doors locked? Do you have your weapon accessible?
Yes to both, Sarah said, grateful that Jake was treating this as a serious threat rather than dismissing her concerns.
Good. I want you to call the police and report this. Even if they can't arrest him for sitting on a public street, you want to start creating a paper trail of his escalating behavior.
They're not going to do anything, Sarah said, frustration creeping into her voice.
He's technically not breaking any laws.
You're probably right that they won't arrest him tonight, Jake agreed.
But, if his behavior continues to escalate, you're going to want documentation showing a pattern of harassment.
Every police report becomes part of that documentation. Sarah knew he was right, but she also knew how humiliating it would be to call the police only to have them tell her there was nothing they could do. She had already been through that experience several times.
Sarah, where are you in your apartment right now? Jake asked. In my bedroom, by the window.
I want you to move away from the window and go to the most secure room in your apartment.
Do you have an interior room without windows? Sarah thought for a moment. The bathroom off my bedroom doesn't have any windows.
Perfect. Take your phone and your weapon and go sit in there while you call the police. And keep me on the line too. Use your landline to call 911 if you have one, or use the conference feature on your phone. As Sarah gathered her things and moved to the bathroom, she felt a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment. She was grateful that Jake was taking her situation seriously and helping her think clearly about how to respond. But she was also embarrassed that her life had become the kind of situation that required hiding in bathrooms and calling for help in the middle of the night. Jake, what if I'm overreacting? She asked as she settled on the bathroom floor with her back against the door.
What if he really just wants to talk, and I'm being paranoid?
Sarah, listen to me carefully. Jake's voice was firm but gentle. Normal people who want to have a conversation don't show up at someone's apartment at 2 in the morning.
Normal people don't call their ex-spouses from the street outside their building. This isn't normal behavior, and your instincts to feel threatened are absolutely correct.
Sarah felt tears of relief prick at her eyes. For months, she had been questioning her own judgment, wondering if she was being too sensitive or too dramatic. Having someone with Jake's experience validate her perceptions meant everything to her. She called 911 and explained the situation to the dispatcher. As predicted, the police officer who arrived 45 minutes later was not particularly helpful. He took her report, spoke briefly with Richard, and then returned to tell Sarah that since Richard wasn't technically trespassing or making explicit threats, there wasn't much they could do. He says he's just trying to work things out with his ex-wife, the officer explained.
Have you considered talking to him?
Sometimes these domestic situations can be resolved with communication. Sarah felt her temper flare at the suggestion that this was somehow her fault for not being willing to communicate with her ex-husband who was stalking her. But she bit back her angry response and simply thanked the officer for coming.
After the police left, Richard's car disappeared as well.
Sarah wasn't sure if the officer had asked him to leave or if he had decided to go on his own, but she was relieved that he was no longer parked outside her building. Jake had stayed on the phone with her throughout the entire interaction with the police. Now, as Sarah sat in her living room trying to calm down enough to go back to sleep, she found herself grateful for his steady presence on the other end of the line. "How are you feeling?" he asked.
"Angry," Sarah admitted.
"Angry that the police officer suggested I should just talk to Richard.
Angry that my ex-husband thinks it's acceptable to show up here in the middle of the night. Angry that I have to hide in my own bathroom because I'm afraid of someone I used to be married to." "All of those feelings are completely justified," Jake said. "You have every right to be angry about this situation. But being angry doesn't solve anything," Sarah said. "I still don't have any legal options. I still can't stop him from doing this. I still have to live with the constant worry that he's going to escalate his behavior. Jake was quiet for a moment before responding. You're right that you can't control his behavior. But, you do have more options than you think you do. Like what? Well, you've already taken some important steps. You've learned to protect yourself, you've documented his harassment, and you've developed a support system of people who take your safety seriously. Those aren't small things. Sarah appreciated Jake's attempt to help her see the positive aspects of her situation, but she still felt helpless in the face of Richard's persistence. Jake, can I ask you something that might sound crazy? Of course. Do you think I should consider moving? Just pack up and start over somewhere else where Richard can't find me? Jake was quiet for so long that Sarah wondered if the call had been dropped. But then he spoke, and his voice was thoughtful rather than dismissive. I think that's a decision only you can make. Moving might give you some peace of mind in the short term, but it would also mean giving up your job, your friends, your life here. And there's no guarantee that Richard wouldn't eventually find you in a new location. Sarah nodded even though Jake couldn't see her. She had been thinking about this option for weeks, but something about it felt like surrendering rather than solving the problem. What would you do if you were in my situation? She asked. Honestly? I'd probably stay and fight. But that's because I have advantages you don't have. I'm bigger, I'm male, and I have extensive training in personal security. Your situation is different, and your decision needs to be based on what's best for you specifically. Sarah appreciated that Jake didn't try to tell her what to do. Too many people in her life had strong opinions about how she should handle her situation, but most of them had never been in anything like it themselves. I don't want to run away, Sarah said finally. I like my job. I like my apartment. I like the life I've built here. It makes me angry to think about giving all of that up because Richard can't accept that our marriage is over. Then, don't give it up, Jake said simply. But make sure you're being smart about how you protect yourself while you stay. As they talked, Sarah realized that something had shifted in her thinking during the course of this frightening evening. Instead of feeling helpless and overwhelmed by Richard's behavior, she was starting to feel determined to take control of the situation. Jake, would you be willing to help me develop a more comprehensive security plan? I mean, beyond just the shooting and tactical training we've been doing? Absolutely. What were you thinking? I want to learn about home security, personal safety protocols, threat assessment, everything I need to know to make it as difficult as possible for Richard to continue harassing me. Sarah could hear the approval in Jake's voice when he responded. Now you're thinking like someone who's serious about taking control of her own safety. Yes, I'll help you with all of that. As they made plans to meet later in the week to discuss security measures, Sarah felt a sense of empowerment that had been missing from her life for months. She was no longer just reacting to Richard's behavior or hoping that someone else would solve her problems for her. She was taking active steps to protect herself and regain control of her life. When she finally hung up the phone and went back to bed, Sarah felt more determined than frightened. Richard's behavior was escalating, but so were her skills and confidence. She was no longer the same woman who had been afraid to pick up a gun 6 months ago. She was becoming someone who was prepared to fight for her right to live safely and peacefully, regardless of what her ex-husband thought he was entitled to. The thought that should have been terrifying, that this situation was probably going to get worse before it got better, somehow didn't frighten her as much as it would have even a few weeks ago. She had skills now, and she had support, and, most importantly, she had a clear understanding of what she was dealing with. Richard could continue his harassment, but he was no longer dealing with someone who doubted her own perceptions or questioned her right to set boundaries. He was dealing with someone who was prepared to defend herself, and that changed everything. The security consultation with Jake revealed just how many vulnerabilities existed in Sarah's daily routine. As they walked through her apartment building and discussed her work schedule, shopping habits, and social activities, Sarah was amazed by how many opportunities Richard had to monitor her movements and predict her whereabouts. The key is to make yourself an unpredictable target, Jake explained as they examined the poorly lit parking garage beneath her building. Right now, you're following patterns that make it easy for someone to know where you'll be and when you'll be there. They spent the next several hours implementing immediate security improvements. Jake helped her install motion sensor lights in her parking space, showed her how to vary her routes to and from work, and taught her techniques for checking whether she was being followed.
Most importantly, he helped her develop what he called layers of security, multiple systems that would make it increasingly difficult for Richard to continue his harassment without facing serious consequences. The restraining order was denied because there wasn't enough evidence of explicit threats, Jake said as they reviewed copies of all her previous police reports. But, if we can document a pattern of escalating behavior, especially behavior that violates your clearly stated boundaries, we can build a much stronger case.
Sarah learned to document everything.
She started keeping a detailed log of every phone call, text message, and sighting of Richard's car near her home or workplace. She set up security cameras that would record anyone approaching her door, and she began varying her schedule in ways that made it impossible for Richard to predict her movements. The changes weren't just practical, they were psychological. Instead of feeling like a victim waiting for the next incident, Sarah began to feel like someone who was actively protecting herself and gathering evidence to stop her harassment. The breakthrough came 3 weeks later, during what started as an ordinary evening at the shooting range. Sarah was working on accuracy drills when Jake appeared beside her lane, his expression serious.
"We need to talk," he said quietly. "Privately."
Sarah immediately saved her weapon and followed Jake to a quiet corner of the range. His next words made her blood run cold.
"I think Richard may be more dangerous than we originally assessed.
My contact at the police department ran a background check that went deeper than the standard divorce investigation.
There are some things you need to know." Sarah felt her legs weaken. "What kind of things?"
"Richard has been arrested twice for domestic violence in previous relationships. The charges were dropped both times, but the arrest reports show a pattern of escalating control and intimidation tactics that matches exactly what he's been doing to you."
Sarah stared at Jake in shock. "How is that possible?"
"I lived with him for 3 years.
I never saw any signs of violence."
"That's actually typical," Jake said gently. "Many abusers are very careful to hide their history from new partners.
They're often charming and attentive during the courtship phase, and they don't show their true nature until after marriage or commitment makes it harder for their partner to leave."
Sarah felt like everything she thought she knew about her marriage was being rewritten. She had always believed that Richard's controlling behavior had developed gradually during their relationship, maybe as a response to stress or changes in his life. The idea that he had been deliberately concealing a history of violence made her feel sick. "Sarah, there's more," Jake continued. "One of the previous arrests involved Richard violating a restraining order. He served 60 days in jail for that violation. But the judge said there wasn't enough evidence to grant me a restraining order," Sarah said, confusion and anger warring in her voice.
"Because Richard is smart enough to be more careful now. He's learned how to harass someone without technically violating the law.
But his behavior is escalating, and, based on his history, I'm concerned that he's building up to something more serious than phone calls and surveillance." Sarah felt terror and relief in equal measure. Terror because the threat to her safety was apparently more serious than she had realized. Relief because her instincts about Richard's potential for violence had been correct, even when everyone around her was suggesting she was overreacting. "What do we do now?" she asked. "Now we take this new information to a different judge and request an emergency restraining order.
With Richard's criminal history and the documentation you've been keeping, we have a much stronger case than before."
Jake had contacted a lawyer who specialized in domestic violence cases, and, within 48 hours Sarah found herself sitting in a courtroom listening to her attorney present evidence of Richard's harassment campaign. The judge reviewed the police reports, the documented phone calls and text messages, the security footage of Richard approaching her building, and, most importantly, the records of his previous arrests. "Mr. Patterson, you have a documented history of violating protective orders," the judge said sternly. "And, Mrs. Chun has provided substantial evidence that you have been engaging in a pattern of harassment and intimidation since your divorce was finalized.
I'm granting the emergency restraining order, and I'm setting a hearing for a permanent order in 30 days. Sarah felt a wave of relief so powerful she thought she might faint.
For the first time in months, she had legal protection against Richard's behavior. If he contacted her or came near her now, he would be arrested. But the relief was short-lived. That evening, as Sarah was leaving work, she noticed Richard's car following her. He stayed exactly the legal distance required by the restraining order, but his presence was clearly meant to intimidate her. He was showing her that even with legal protection, he could still find ways to make her feel unsafe. Sarah called Jake immediately.
He's following me, but he's staying far enough away that he's not technically violating the restraining order. Where are you now? Driving home from work.
He's been behind me for about 10 minutes.
Don't go home, Jake said immediately. Drive to the police station instead. Even if he's not technically violating the order, this behavior needs to be documented. Sarah changed direction and headed toward the police station.
As she pulled into the parking lot, she expected Richard to drive away. Instead, he parked across the street and sat in his car, watching her. The police officer who took her report was more helpful than previous officers had been. He's not violating the letter of the restraining order, but he's definitely violating the spirit of it, the officer said. We'll go talk to him and make it clear that this behavior needs to stop. Sarah watched through the station window as two officers approached Richard's car. She couldn't hear the conversation, but she could see Richard gesturing and apparently explaining himself. After about 10 minutes, the officers returned to the station while Richard drove away. We told him that following you, even at a legal distance, constitutes harassment and that continued behavior like this could result in arrest, the officer explained. He claims he was just driving in the same direction you were, but we made it clear that we don't believe that explanation. As Sarah drove home that evening, she realized that having legal protection felt different than she had expected. The restraining order was an important tool, but it wasn't a magic solution that would make Richard disappear from her life. He was still going to look for ways to intimidate her, and she was still going to need to be vigilant about her safety. But something fundamental had changed in how she viewed the situation. She was no longer fighting this battle alone, and she was no longer doubting her own perceptions. She had legal backing, documentation, and, most importantly, a clear understanding of exactly what she was dealing with. 2 days later, Sarah was at the shooting range working on advanced tactical drills when Jake approached with an expression she had never seen before. He looked proud, concerned, and determined all at the same time. Sarah, I need you to listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you, he said. Richard violated the restraining order last night. He was arrested outside your apartment building at 3 in the morning. Sarah felt her heart stop. What was he doing there? According to the police report, he was trying to leave a letter under your door. A security camera caught him in the hallway, and the building manager called the police. He's been charged with violating a protective order, and since he has a history of the same charge, this could mean serious jail time. Sarah sank into a nearby chair, overwhelmed by a mixture of relief and exhaustion. Is this over? I mean, will this finally end it? Jake sat down beside her. It's a significant development. Violating a restraining order is a serious charge, especially for someone with Richard's history. But I want you to understand that this might actually be the most dangerous time for you. Sarah looked at him in alarm. What do you mean? When people like Richard lose their primary method of control and intimidation, they sometimes escalate to more desperate measures. He's facing jail time, he's lost his ability to contact you legally, and his harassment campaign has been exposed publicly. People in that situation sometimes become willing to take risks they wouldn't have considered before. Sarah felt fear creep back into her consciousness just as she had begun to hope that her ordeal might be ending. So what do I do? You stay alert, you continue following all the security protocols we've established, and you trust your training. You've come so far from where you were 6 months ago, Sarah. You're not the same person who was afraid to pick up a gun. As if to prove his point, Jake handed Sarah her pistol and positioned a fresh target at the far end of the range. Show me what you've learned. Sarah took her stance, controlled her breathing, and fired a perfect grouping into the center of the target. 6 months ago, she had been terrified of firearms and unsure of her ability to protect herself. Now she was confident, competent, and clear about her right to safety and security. Perfect, Jake said, and Sarah could hear genuine pride in his voice. You're ready for whatever comes next. As they packed up their equipment, Sarah realized that Jake was right. She wasn't the same person who had started this journey. She had learned to trust her instincts, developed real skills for protecting herself, and built a support system of people who took her safety seriously. Richard might try to escalate his behavior, but he would no longer be dealing with someone who doubted her own perceptions or felt helpless in the face of threats. He would be dealing with someone who was prepared, trained, and determined to defend her right to live peacefully. Walking to her car that evening, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in over a year. She felt safe. Not because the danger had disappeared, but because she had become someone capable of handling danger. The woman who had been swapping out targets 6 months ago had been looking for something to shoot at. The woman walking across the parking lot now knew that the most important target she had ever needed to hit was her own fear, doubt, and feelings of helplessness. And she had hit that target perfectly. As she drove home, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Jake.
Remember, courage isn't the absence of fear. It's feeling afraid and doing what you need to do anyway. You've got this. Sarah smiled as she read his message. She did have this. Whatever came next, she was ready for it. Richard had taught her to be afraid, but Jake had taught her to be strong. And, in the end, strength would always triumph over fear. The woman who had once been terrified of her own shadow was now someone who cast shadows of her own, shadows that would protect her and anyone else who needed protection. She had found her weapon, learned to use it, and, most importantly, discovered that the most powerful weapon she possessed was her own determination to never be a victim again. The targets had taught her to aim. Life had taught her what to shoot for. And, now, finally, she was ready for anything.